What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, I'm going to compare Samsung's flagship S25s to the new budget fan edition phone that shares their same name, the S25 FE. Now, I feel like most of you probably know what the FE is all about, but if not, here's a quick refresher. The FE is a cheaper, slightly spec'd down, but usually just as good alternative to the more expensive top-of-the-line flagship S series. The S20 FE was the first, and it was a fun, colorful, cheaper, near flagship phone that was wildly popular. And over the last few years, Samsung has kept keeping on with these FEs, even though their appeal has sort of fizzled out. The reason for this is, in my opinion, twofold. One, as you'll see in a second, the FE has become victim to some spec downgrades, which makes the phone less appealing, even at a cheaper price, versus the flagship variant. The other reason, the big one, is price, but it has less to do with the FE directly and more to do with these flagship phones that have been out now for nearly a year. Technically, the full retail price for this year's S25 FE is $649. Not insignificant by any means, but a far friendlier price compared to the $799 flagship S25 and nearly $1,000 S25 Plus. The price problem is revealed if you take even 60 seconds to search Samsung's S series right now on any shopping website, or even browse Samsung's own website. Here, Samsung has discounted the S25 by $80, which makes the price differential between this and the FE a lot less significant. If you jump on over to Amazon, the FE is even cheaper, and this is a brand new phone, by the way, also direct from Samsung. But if you're okay going used or are familiar with Amazon Renewed, which, by the way, I do highly recommend, you can instead snag this current S25 flagship for as low as $460, which is way cheaper than the FE. And the S25 Plus is also cheaper than the FE on Amazon, which is crazy. This isn't unusual though. Samsung's S25 series has been out now for months. The new phones aren't even that far away. Samsung regularly has deals and discounts, even pre-order promotions, and when you factor in carrier deals, it's unlikely you'll ever pay full price for any of these phones, really. But the fact of the matter is that you can easily find the better phones, the flagship S25s, for a discounted price or at an even cheaper price than this brand new S25 FE. This FE will plummet in price too. All things even out eventually. But for the first few weeks, or a month or two maybe, it really doesn't make sense to choose the FE if you do even the minimum amount of price comparing. Now, let's just say that your carrier is offering you this new S25 FE for free, or you're watching this video months from now and the FE is half price, or maybe the FE is the only option in your area, or you just want this phone no matter what. That's fine. Let's now talk about what actually differentiates it from the flagship counterparts, the important stuff they share, and why that is important to think about. Now, one perk of choosing the FE is its big size, but only because its immediate alternative is unusually small. At 6.7 inches, the FE is actually the same size as like 95% of Android phones nowadays. The regular flagship S25 is 6.2 inches, which is one of the smaller phones you can buy right now. Kind of an odd thing to think about, but it's true. The FE is actually the same size as the S25 Plus. So if you ignore that pricing situation I harped on earlier, it actually feels like a good deal getting the larger FE when its twin flagship brethren is officially a lot more money. Between the trio, the regular flagship S25 is the odd one out for sure. And I think that phone nowadays really only appeals to people who specifically want a smaller sized phone. It's basically your only option. Around back, the FE kind of looks like the flagship phones, but there are a couple very small details that people like to point out. I mean, if I switched up the FE and the S25 Plus behind my back and asked you to identify them, you'd still have a hard time at a glance. They're all built from basically the same material, just a different version of Gorilla Glass Victus. They rock an all-aluminum frame. The FE just gets the bare metal look, while the flagships are a color-matched finish. And speaking of color, the blue FE is a slightly duller, grayer looking blue than all the other blue Samsung phones, which are the exact same shade. So that's kind of weird, just thought I'd point that out. And the other tiny little thing is that the FE still has that bare metal finish on the camera rings. I have no idea why, but that's the only other physical difference between these phones. Everything else is exactly the same all around. There's separate cell and network antennas on the sides of the flagship phones, but the power and volume buttons are the same, the mic holes up top are the same, and down at the bottom, the USB-C ports and speaker cutouts are all the same too. You also don't get an SD card slot on any of these phones. The FE dropped that a few years ago. And I should just quickly mention that for the storage options, the FE and the regular S25 both start at 128 gigabytes, while the S25 Plus starts at 256 gigabytes. So maybe that's an additional consideration for the Plus specifically, especially since 128 gigs of base storage is probably not enough nowadays. For whatever reason, Samsung still hasn't brought the flagship fingerprint sensor to the FE, so mark one more tally in the flagship column, I guess. It's not a huge deal. You can still unlock the FE fast enough, but it's obviously not as quick and requires that additional moment of holding your thumb down instead of a quick touch like on the flagships. When it comes to the screens, aside from the size difference, there are a couple other things to consider. Generally speaking though, the specs and viewing experience between the FE and the flagships is going to be super similar. All three phones offer a dynamic AMOLED 2X panel, and they all are 120Hz high refresh rate displays. The flagship S25 and the S25 FE are 1080p resolution screens, while the S25 Plus can be set to a Quad HD 1440p resolution. In addition, the flagship S25s can achieve a higher peak brightness, 2600 nits, and I suppose you could argue their Victus 2 Gorilla Glass might be a little tougher and a little less glare prone, but I don't consider that an outright advantage. While the brightness boost on the flagship phones is certainly valuable, I think the Quad HD resolution on the S25 Plus is more of a deciding factor. This is just a special option for this phone. It's not something you get on many other Android devices in general, and while it might be hard to tell, the big screen on this phone does look a bit sharper with that QHD enabled. In general though, I do still think there's a ton of value in getting the FE with basically the same screen as the flagship phones, though nowadays I totally understand that the bare minimum smartphone display is basically what these phones offer. So it sort of depends on your perspective and what you currently have in your pocket, but it's at least nice to see that Samsung didn't explicitly leave anything major off the FE and still kept the S25 Plus sort of special with its higher resolution. I'll also just quickly say that the speakers sound exactly the same on all three phones. I can't imagine there's any actual hardware difference, and if there is, I can't hear it anyway. They sound exactly the same even at max volume. So the single biggest miss with the S25 FE, in my opinion, is Samsung's choice to go with anything but the current flagship Snapdragon chip. When the FE first launched, that was its big, huge selling point. Flagship speeds and performance at a discounted price. The S20 FE and S21 FE had the same internal specs as the flagship namesakes, but starting with the S23 FE, Samsung broadened the processor gap, and now this FE is stuck with an Exynos 2400 inside. That is, frankly, not great news. And not just because of the stigma that's still attached with the Exynos name, but just the undeniable fact that this processor is not as good as what's inside the flagships. On top of that, the FE has just 8 gigabytes of RAM, while the flagships have 12 gigabytes. So altogether, the FE is no longer the same spec as the flagship phones, and it doesn't offer the same level of performance. Now, you could certainly argue that in general day-to-day use, the average person probably wouldn't notice. And I will agree that Samsung still has to offer you some reason to choose the flagship phones over the FE, and maybe they realized that with basically all else even now, this was what they had to do to ensure some provenance to the flagships. Rumors suggest that it might also be a cost thing. The Snapdragon processors are pricey, the FE is supposed to be more affordable. Whatever the actual reason, or combination of reasons, the fact remains that previous FE owners are probably a bit grumpy about what this FE now offers. And if you wanted one clear-cut reason to consider the flagships, well, this is it right here. On the bright side, there's nothing software-wise that separates the FE from the flagships. All the Galaxy AI goodies are present, the FE will get 7 software updates over its lifetime. It's just not a flagship phone in spec like it once was, which is a little disappointing. Something that's a little strange about this FE is that Samsung actually gave this phone faster charging speeds than the flagship S25, at least the smaller regular S25. The FE can charge at 45-watt wired speeds. You'll get 65% juice in about 30 minutes. The S25 Plus has that same charging speed, but the smaller regular S25 got stuck with 25-watt wired charging speeds for some unknown reason. And all three phones offer wireless charging, so no difference there. The other power-related difference, obviously, is battery size. The FE and the Plus, since they're larger phones, have a larger 4900 mAh battery inside, while the smaller S25 gets a 4000 mAh battery. That generally means the FE and the Plus will last longer than the regular S25 during day-to-day usage, and those two phones are actually pretty similar in their longevity. So I suppose if you want to put a half tally in the FE column over the regular S25, you could. Finally, something I find really interesting about the FE versus flagship situation is that on paper, the FE's camera setup is really not that different from the flagship phones. And I think this speaks more on the fact that Samsung's S25 Ultra is really their most camera-focused smartphone, while the flagships retain good but not over-the-top shooting capabilities. Both the FE and the flagship phones have 50-megapixel main lenses, but the camera sensors are a little different in favor of the flagships. The FE has a telephoto lens, which is actually a pretty big plus. It's an 8 megapixel to the flagship's 10 megapixel, but it actually has the same optical 3x range and 30x digital range. And the 12 megapixel ultra-wide lenses on all three phones are pretty similar too. Even the selfie camera up front, the 12 megapixel shooter, seems to be nearly the same on all three. And inside the camera app, whether you're shooting with the FE or flipping through the camera modes on the flagships, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find any significant differences. Like I said, if you were comparing the FE to the Ultra, obviously that would be night and day, but between all three S25s here, I'm surprised to see just how similar they are. I think the flagship camera setup just hasn't evolved much, and the FE's has basically caught up to a point where Samsung couldn't have made it much worse, or else it would have just looked really, really bad. And you can see here that even the picture samples look very similar too. I feel like chalking up another point for the FE in this case, simply because this is another area of value for this phone versus the more expensive flagships, and I wonder if it's maybe an overlooked advantage. I feel like the FE's camera setup is more than the budget or mid-tier positioning this phone is supposed to be at, especially if you do make the full comparison to the flagship phones. So here's the deal. Obviously, the flagship S25s have a handful of advantages still over the FE. They should, and I'm glad that's still the case. The S25 Plus has a unique higher resolution display. The current Qualcomm processor is reserved only for the flagships. They do get more RAM, and a couple other very small minor things if you pick apart the spec sheets. But the real kicker here is that while the FE is supposed to be a more affordable but just as good option, the flagships can be bought for much, much cheaper. And the flagship phones really haven't evolved much the last few years, which means the FE almost had to be downgraded in a way, mainly with its performance capabilities. I don't think the FE is a bad phone necessarily, but I can't imagine any situation where it's a worthwhile buy when these flagship phones are available for hundreds of dollars less now. But what do you guys think? Am I missing something here? Is the FE enticing at all? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.